it's not an easy path, but if we're already suffering, why not look at it? Why not be with it? Why not work with it? Why not transmute it in some way?
Anytime that I have been suffering and I've sat with the suffering and looked at the question of why am I here again, it always leads to transformation. Welcome, welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Tracee. I'm happy to be here and to see you.
I'm happy to see you too. And I'm even happier that this beautiful book is out in the world.
Yeah, it's exciting.
It
I
is
have it here
exciting.
too on my desk. So yeah,
Yeah, it's very beautiful. Um, okay, let's just get right into the thick of things. I want to read this beautiful quote from Thich Nhat Hanh that you start chapter 1 with. We need suffering in order to see the path. The origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path leading to the cessation of suffering are all found in the heart of suffering. If we are afraid to touch our suffering, we will not be able to realize the path of peace, joy, and liberation. Don't run away. Make peace with it. I feel like that sums up so much. And yet we have to parse out all the suffering because we're so
hmm
used to looking away from it. And so today in June, um, I don't know what the date is. Is it like the 12th?
it's the 12th. It's actually my father's birthday. He transitioned in 2017, but it's his birthday. It's June 12th.
Mm, okay. So
Yeah.
June 12th, 2024. Why are these tools and concepts so important on this day?
There's so much I could say about this and in response to your question about why these tools are important and specifically the practice of leaning into suffering so that we can better understand why we suffer and the nature of our suffering, the root causes of it. And I'm present to so much. I'm present to the multiple genocides that are happening in the world. I'm present to climate chaos. I was just outside sitting with my honeybees, so I'm present to climate chaos. Um, I'm present to people who are hungry and don't have enough food. I'm present to people who don't have housing. I'm present to the way we are conditioned to believe we are separate from the more than human world and nature. And I think these tools around leaning into suffering and these practices are important because we keep replicating the same samskaras and patterns and tendencies that keep us in a place of suffering. Um, of course, we are humans, are implicated in systems that perpetuate suffering. And I also think so many of us are unsure of what to do in response to suffering. And sometimes the overwhelm that accompanies us leaning into suffering and then feeling overwhelmed makes us want to bypass suffering, which I just feel like if we don't, as this quote suggests, look into it and understand that our path to liberation is actually through a deeper understanding of what gets in the way of liberation, right? Which we might call suffering. I don't feel like we can get to that place of freedom, of peace, of ease, unless we're willing to lean into why do these things keep happening and what is making them happen and what conditions are in place that make it so many of us suffer, so that many of us suffer, and the more than human world, of course, is suffering. And there can be a real resistance to suffering. I was um, guiding a book reading on Saturday, and I was talking about this book and suffering. And I was kind of like, "Thanks for hanging out with me on Saturday night when we're talking about suffering and how we're all gonna die." Like I was talking about the kleshas, and I was sort of chuckling, like I just did, with an awareness that it's not an easy path, but if we're already suffering, why not look at it? Why not be with it? Why not work with it? Why not transmute it in some way?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I know just from my own personal experience that anytime that I have been suffering and I've sat with the suffering and looked at the question of why am I here again, it always leads to transformation. Anytime I've ever been in conflict with another person, and instead of running away, sat with it, sat with them, and talked through it, something has transformed. So, what I hear you saying is that there is this collective avidya that we need to transmute in order
Yes.
to be free, in order for the collective to have some ease and some joy and not be stuck. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about first, if you can talk about avidya,
Mhm.
um, and maybe how avidya helps us to, well, not helps us, but how avidya is kind of creating how we experience the difference between Purusha and Prakriti, and how that's leading to this like cycle of more karmic suffering, um, and a cycle that feels like it can't be broken.
Mhm. Yeah, so I know you know this because you teach about this, and I'll just share for people who may not be as familiar with the Yoga Sutras that Sutra 2.12 talks about the link between the obstacles, the kleshas. Avidya is the first klesha, and avidya means often it's translated as ignorance or a lack of clear sight or the belief that we're separate. I mean, I've written about it in all of these ways
Mhm.
in Illuminating Our True Nature. And so Sutra 2.12 says the kleshas, the obstacles, some of which may be visible to us and some which may be non-visible, lead to our tendencies, which I just mentioned, samskaras, our patterns. And patterns are formed around these root causes of suffering. And then there's an action and a consequence, which is karma. Um, and this cycle continues. The other piece about this in the Yoga Sutras is that and it actually relates to the final klesha, abhinivesha, but really all of the kleshas because they're interrelated, is that um, once we transition out of these incarnations of self, as we are now, and if we are reborn, the moment we come back into being, we both remember what it was like to die, and then we cling to life, which is the essence of abhinivesha, this clinging and fear of letting go. And we have our karma with us, and that's painful and sort of sets this cycle of the kleshas in motion again. There's a lot more to this, but I'm sort of just sharing the
Right.
like,
Yeah. These are the
here,
highlights that we need to know, basically.
right. I just want to honor that there's a lot more to
There's a
this,
lot more. Yeah.
but there's that. And so avidya, this lack of, I just wanted to link that together for people, and this lack of clear sight or this belief that we're separate feels like, I've been saying, it's the root of the root of the root, in that I think it's the spiritual crisis. I think it
Yeah.
relates to everything I named about suffering. I think it's embedded in systems, the way have been conditioned to believe I'm separate and this individual, as if I'm not connected or didn't come from Purusha pure consciousness, and as if everything that is around me or that has been didn't derive from pure consciousness. And Prakriti is the matter, right? And we are made in these bodies and matter, and there can be a tension, I think, between the awareness of pure consciousness and even the experience of accessing that at different times through meditation, through mantra, through different practices. So this tension between, I'm aware that this divine spark that is in me resides within everyone, and I'm in this body and wedded to these identities and this humanness and earthly experience I'm having. I think that causes a lot of discomfort, or can, for people, coupled with what I named about our conditioning around believing we're separate from one another. And I think so much of what we see unfolding is a result of all of the kleshas, for sure. But avidya, because it is about ignorance and the inability to really sense and see what is actually going on. That's why I think it's the root of the root of the root, that I think it begins, our suffering begins in this place of separation, right, as we come into being, and then that being upheld as we grow and navigate the world. So much so that we can't actually connect to that divine spark that resides within all beings. I think this explains why there are wars and genocides, and I can
Absolutely.
extract from the earth. If it's not part of me, if it didn't come from
Right.
a divine place, and if I, in fact, do not believe I'm divine,
Yeah.
right, then I
Yeah.
will do whatever I want to do, right? I will feel entitled, I will take, I will discount, I will invalidate. Um, and I write about this in this book, this way that a video can make us feel untethered to
Mm,
pure consciousness, or untethered to,
absolutely.
like,
Right.
source, where did we come from, the
That's
above
right.
and the below, right? The
Mhm.
earth, the actual ground, where will we return to in
Yeah.
some way, right? And so these are some of my thoughts. I have a lot, but about avidya and why it's at the core of it all.
I completely agree. I mean, the separation, um, specifically, I think even the separation from nature, that we think we're separate from nature, that we don't understand that we are nature, allows me to believe that I'm separate from you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yes.
um, do you want to say anything more about
I just was
it? I mean,
thinking
I feel
about
like we could talk about this for probably 5 hours
that. We could talk
or
about
more.
that one thing
This just
around
one. Yeah.
nature, and how, I mean, it just, what you said about how, if I'm divorced from the reality that I am nature, that everything that is reflected outside of me, or that which I believe is outside of me, is actually inside me, right?
Right.
It's part of me. What that points to or means about how I regard other beings. I mean, it's just I understand it when I look at and interrogate conditioning and training and patterns, the samskaras, and I'm sort of astounded, because the earth feels so precious to me. The more than human world is such a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
um, that I've been called in, to commune with and into union with. And I worry about what will happen if we continue. I mean, this about me. I worry
Yeah.
about where we're
Well,
going.
yeah, I worry about it too. There's only one answer, which is realize that you're not separate.
Right.
That's really the answer. And that's really hard to do, because even if we know it on an intellectual level, we have to have an experience of it.
Yeah.
And so we have to make time for the stillness and the silence and the rest to be able to have that experience and to be open to the experience. Um, yes, there's so much. So I want to ask you about the bees and how the bees maybe have helped you to even understand this more, have a more embodied understanding of it. I know you've known this for a long time, but I love hearing about the bees. So I want to hear about the bees and avidya.
I love talking about the bees. Um, I said I was in a hammock a few minutes before logging on for this conversation, and I was near the beehives. I have 4 hives, and I was just watching them. They were pretty busy because they had just finished orientation flights, which that's the flight where um, the foragers, or bees who are about to become foragers, orient to their home hive so they know where to return to when they gather and bring resources back to the hive. And you know this, but I'll name that the bees, I feel like they've been such powerful teachers, um, in teaching me about community and what it means to be a superorganism, and to um, think of yourself as an extension of the hive versus as a separate being.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not in a honeybee's consciousness. I mean, I've shamanically journeyed to them, I've talked to them, I've chanted next to them, I've hummed with them, and enough scientists and I would say shamanic practitioners and nature-based practitioners have worked with the bees enough to know, based on the way the honeybees work and that they do everything in service of the hive, that they don't see themselves as separate. The sound, the vibration, the hum, right? They're attuning to one another all of the time and assessing, often through sound or movement, or their antennae, the way they communicate or dance, they're assessing what the hive needs, which humans, I mean, I sit and wonder what it would be like for us to think of ourselves as superorganisms. Like, what would that be like? How would we operate, right?
Yeah.
It would require a lot of practice around attunement. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is going on with you? What might you need? Some of that's through words, some of that's through movement, some of that's through sound, just as the bees operate. And so, as I think about avidya or vidya, the opposite of avidya, of course, I mean, so many parts of our ecosystem and the more than human world mirror this to us. And the honeybees are, because they're a superorganism, they're a really good example of what it means to live and work in service of something bigger, which certainly aligns with the practice and path of yoga, and what it calls us into. So they're just such a teacher for that. What does it mean? And in interacting with them, if I go into a hive, and I don't go into my hives very much, but if I go into the hive and I think it's about me, then they will let me know this is not about you. They will buzz at me, they will headbutt me, they will tell me to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
They will give me all the warning signs before they sting me if I'm doing something that feels threatening to their hive. So they're attuned to one another, and then I'm going in, and they're like, you should attune with us if you actually want to move through this in a way that's mindful, responsible, caring, right, thoughtful. So they're communicating all of the time, and I love that as well as a teacher, the way they're like, this isn't about you. This is about us. And you can come in as long as you attune to our environment and the way we're operating here.
I really love hearing this because it reminds me of being a space holder in community, in, let's say, a retreat or a yoga workshop or some kind of spiritual space. It feels like those same attunements apply to having a space that is going to be nurturing and is going to be in service for everyone else. So yeah, thank you for illustrating that, because I feel like I can really drop into what that means. I've felt it before, obviously, teaching what it means to be in attunement with the people that are in the space, and to just kind of project that now into the bees. It really resonates. And so that kind of brings me to another question around your social location wheel. So I looked at the wheel and how it relates to oppression. And it really brought me back to when I moved to South Africa 6 months after apartheid was outlawed and Nelson Mandela had become president. And how, first of all, just because apartheid had been outlawed, it was still in the psyche. It was still in the psychic atmosphere. It was still in the mental vrittis that were going. Nothing had really changed. I mean, there had been some things that had changed, but not a lot. And so I would love for you to speak about this idea of the social location wheel, Ashmita, and how that relates to power and privilege, because I thought it was really fascinating chapter in the book.
Yeah. So Ashmita is the second klesha or obstacle, and Samkara is the ego, and Ashmita is the over-identification with ego. It's the connection between the two. And I've written a lot about ego and different parts of the ego, and how we need ego to do certain things, to create certain things, and that there's a way that and this is the expression of Ashmita, and I'll connect it to the wheel and oppression, that there's a way we over-identify with, and it's the opposite of a superorganism, with ego, with I-ness versus we are, or we all come from that divine spark and Purusha, pure consciousness and creation in that way. And there are 3 chapters about Ashmita, which that's true of each klesha. And I wanted to include the social location wheel and some commentary and, an offering about oppression, because I think a social and cultural manifestation of Ashmita is a hierarchy of bodies and systems of dominance and power over, in that based on people's identities and how hierarchies have been set up, that if I'm more proximal to social and institutional power, and it relates to what we said about nature, then I can believe I am better than, more worthy, valid, valuable, deserving, and that folks who are less proximal to social and institutional power, and this is where the wheel comes into play, that we think about the different identities we embody and where that places us related to social and institutional power, not personal power necessarily, or the power that we believe cannot be taken from us, right? The divine power that I feel that I'm bigger than this body. Not that, but more what systems have created and the systems of power they've created. And I feel like, again, this relates to so much of what is happening. And so it felt important to me to name, this is a reality. The identities we embody affect us. They affect how we navigate the world. And if we think about the sort of most expressive manifestation of I-ness, I mean, we have many examples of this and principalities playing out right now that are not in service of liberation at all, and that, keep us in a place of suffering, likely because of shadow and their own suffering. And I don't just mean one person, but that these things are in place, that it's important to understand the identities and how they affect us. It's also, and I wrote about this too, important to understand I am not solely the identities I embody. So there's the analysis piece of the social location wheel, and then there's the understanding that I'm a spiritual being beyond this body. So what I was saying about the most expressive manifestation of I-ness, right? We can think about that, and then at whose expense and what happens in response to an internalization that one's life, their identities, their possessions, what they want to have, their desires are more important than those who are less proximal to power.
And so in the spiritual world, quote unquote,
Yeah.
how does the spiritual bypassing lead into more suffering? And
I love this.
how can we shift it?
Yeah, I love this question and the like transmutation of that. I feel like spiritual bypassing is a way that we engage our spiritual practice to avoid the suffering, to avoid pain, to avoid the truth of what is happening. We could talk about it in many ways. And I think the absolute truths presented in many spiritual lineages, and I've talked a lot about this, that are centered around our oneness or our interconnectedness, which I certainly believe we're interconnected, but the teachings around the absolute truths can be offered in a way that tries to neutralize the relative truth. So, for example, while I'm a spiritual being, I understand this. I can't neutralize my Blackness in a white supremacy culture. That's just not
right.
That's not going to happen. Just like I can't neutralize, I'm cisgender. I can't neutralize my cisness, right, in a transphobic culture or a patriarchal culture. That's impossible for me to do, even if I have moments in meditations where I feel like I'm part of everyone and everything and identity doesn't matter. I've had that experience at least one time. It wasn't that identity didn't matter. It was that I felt connected to everything around me.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is what that it lasted for a minute, but this is what it is, right? To access that. That was great. And then I had to walk out of the door and leave that teacher and interact with the world. So I think that it's important for people to be responsible um, and aware of the relative truth and how people are impacted differently by systems and the relative truth as we hold the absolute truths, right? And so often what I say is if I believe we are one, what does that mean about what I need to do to create conditions for us all to experience that oneness, or what we need? Not that I can define that for everyone given the context. Um, so I think that's one way to transmute it, is to have some clear analysis about how power works alongside engaging in the power of our spiritual practice, right? We need both, because we're in the middle realm, we're on earth. We I don't believe can transcend what is happening. That's Jasper on
Jasper.
I don't even know what he's barking at. He was like, yeah, yeah, mom, yeah. I don't believe we can transcend this earthly experience. And so many, I mean, the sutras and the Bhagavad Gita and other texts talk about the earthly experience and the spiritual experience, and that we have a responsibility to connect to both, to be aware
Yeah.
of both.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say, like, as space holders, as teachers, as practitioners, as people trying to make meaning of what's going on, we have to connect. And it relates to the Thich Nhat Hanh quote, like, we have to connect to the suffering or the root or these systems of oppression, the relative truth, as we understand the absolute truths and what's in the way of the absolute truths being fully expressed in this earthly realm.
So if there was one klesha, and maybe you can tell us the other kleshas that we haven't talked about yet, and then answer the question for me of, if there was one klesha that you thought as a collective we should focus on, what would that be? So we've already gone through avidya and we've gone through ashmita.
Yes, and there is raga, which is an attachment to pleasure, devesha, avoidance or aversion, and abhinivesha, clinging to life, fear of letting go, fear of transition. It's really difficult for me to answer this question. And because I think avidya is the root of it, and they're interrelated, as I said, I think I think avidya and abhinivesha, I mean, all of them, but I think those two are really, they're very connected to one another. And there's, I would say avidya, but I'm also feeling into abhinivesha in the way that we resist death in all
Right.
the ways,
In all
not
its
just,
forms. Yeah.
yeah, not just not just physical death. And depending on where we're from culturally, like the way that I grew up in the US and the South, and death was not talked about. And we hardly had rituals around it. And I often think about, if I'm aware I'm going to transition at some point and I don't know when, that might call me into a different way of being and living my life. And hopefully, and who knows, if I am aware that I will die and I practice, I mean, this is what Shavasana feels like for me. I get to practice dying over and over and hopefully reawakening, coming back until I don't anymore. But there's this preparation so that hopefully there can be more ease and I'm not clinging on to life, right, in this way that causes more suffering for myself or folks who might be around me preparing to let go. So that one feels very present too. But I would say avidya because of what separation or belief that we're separate leads to. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Even more reason why we need to practice rest.
It's true. That's very
Because,
true.
yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the resistance, that clinging. Yeah. You have a lot of practices in the book, which I love because I always love to be able to practice. And you have asana practices. So talk to me about why you included the asana practices in the book, which I love. Every single little picture I look at, I'm like, oh, I love this picture.
That's Michelle. Yeah. Yeah. So there are 5 sections that correspond with the 5 kleshas. And then each section ends with each section has 3 chapters and ends with 5 practices. And asana is one of the practices. So asana, um, pranayama, meditation, mudra, mantra, not always in that order. Some are combined. And I included asana because I only included one asana for each chapter. So mostly, so people can put it all together if they would like, or they can work with one asana, the one I offered, or something else that speaks to them. The asanas correspond with the antidote or the way we might respond to or disrupt a specific klesha, or just work with it to understand it. And I feel like I included them because I'm like in this body, which is very dense, and sometimes it's accessible and it is helpful for me to work with the physical form. And I think that's can be true for other people as an opening to the other practices.
Yeah.
So sometimes I can like move into the posture, and of course I'm breathing, but I may not be breathing with intention. Then I move out of the posture and I'm invited into a pranayama practice, or to combine that with the asana, or a meditation, or to hold a mudra in meditation, or after that to engage in mantra. So it's purposeful that the asanas are first, to get into to move to work with that sheath, that layer, right, of the body. Because I mean, this may not be true for, I don't know, a lot of people I've encountered also feel that like working with shaping, and I don't mean like refining, but working with the physical form can be the opening.
Absolutely.
So that's why I included it in the book.
I love that you included it. What did you learn during this process, either about yourself or about the kleshas that you didn't think about prior? What did you learn in the process of writing this book?
This was not an easy book to write. I have always been drawn to the Bhagavad Gita, and I had to fall in love, I will say, with the Yoga Sutras and the kleshas. So there was a relationship that had to be built in a different way. And like I have reverence for the Yoga Sutras and this pathway of yoga, and I had to deepen that reverence and really honor the teachings and sit with them in a different way than I had before, I would say. And I also had a question about whether or not I should write the book. Originally, my editor from Shambhala, Beth, suggested I write this book. And she saw me teach about the kleshas, and she's like, I think you have something to say. And I was kind of like, I don't know. Yet I had been teaching about them. So she knew, she saw something. But I really sat for a while and thought, based on my lineage, and yes, I'm devoted to the path and the practice, should I write about the kleshas? Like, is this in alignment? I had a really, based on where I learned, like I was just like, is this the thing I need to do? And I got the answer in meditation one day that yes, start writing it. I was 6 chapters in before I felt like, okay, yeah, I absolutely have something to say about suffering. I talk about it all the time. So why not, engage that or include that in a framework that is focused on the kleshas and what we do in response to them, so we experience less suffering individually and collectively. So it was a journey in a different way than the other books I've written, and that this was a download too, I would say, but the flow was different. And I think I had to work through the kleshas not that I'm there yet, but I had to work through each one and
Mm,
really understand, how is this showing up for me right now, so that I could share a story that would be accessible and applicable in some way for folks who, like me, learned about the Yoga Sutras in a teacher training, and then they were like, no, and I went to the Bhagavad Gita instead, right? No, I'm not
yeah.
engaging with this text, or I don't understand it, or it's saying the same thing. I mean, people have a lot of, it can take some time to I mean, a lifetime or more to understand a text that, I mean,
Yeah. And
was,
most
yeah,
teacher trainings like fly by the,
totally,
yamas and the niyamas. It's like, oh, here's the kleshas and moving on. So I'm really
yeah.
glad that you wrote this book so that we can take a deep dive. And it's also very accessible. And I wonder, which klesha did you feel was most present for you in the writing when you said you went through each one and kind
Yeah,
of tuned in?
I would say Raga, the third one, attachment to pleasure.
Mm,
Um, because I wrote this, I'm trying to think, I guess mostly 2020, part of 2021, 2022, maybe. No, maybe it was 2022. Anyway, I was reflecting a lot on COVID and patterns that samskaras that I fell into, I don't know, during COVID when I was isolated,
mm,
like watching TV for hours, right? Or
mhm,
drinking wine and watching TV,
mhm.
and not engaging in my life.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I was engaged in my life, but not, I just noticed some patterns that had not been there before. In that particular way, really hadn't been there before, that emerged during that time of isolation or operating in a different way, that had stuck, right? That had, like,
Yeah.
I was definitely in the pattern of doing that. And instead, I wanted to like read a book, but I'd be like, I guess I'm sitting on the couch tonight and doing this again, and like ordering things off the internet that I don't need. And so
Right.
that was that was the most difficult, to really try to break those patterns, but also understand why I'm not judging myself. And they don't feed me, they don't nourish
Mm,
me. Those
yeah.
things, I need to go to bed. Like, they don't support me or what I do in the world or my life force, um, in the way I was engaged. Like, there's excess, right? And so it was
Mhm.
this belief
Yes.
that I was receiving pleasure from these things when actually I wasn't. I didn't feel well when I woke up the next day, or
Mm,
and I was
mhm.
just like doing it sort of mindlessly. So I would say that was the one that was most present,
Yeah.
that I might struggle with the most, that I'm aware of.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So, as we come to a close, what would you want to leave people with? And that can be anything from a short meditation to just one of the mantras from the book, anything that you want to leave us with.
I think maybe the blessing that's at the
Yeah.
end of the book. Um, yeah, it's at the end, and it's my wish and desire for, um, this book, body of work, the teachings, which of course I was translating and applying to my life in the current context. So I'll read that. May you return to this text and the teachings contained in it time and time again. May you be safe on your path. May you be reverent. May you know you are infinitely connected to all that has been, is now, and will be. May you find peace. May you melt into the sun, and when it is time, dance with spirit. May we all find peace, melt into the sun, and dance with spirit. This is my prayer. I will hold it close to my heart as I journey forward on this path of life and yoga.
Thank you for that. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for just sharing all of your wisdom, illuminating our true nature. Yeah. Available everywhere books are.
Everywhere books are, yes, yes.
Okay. Is there a book club happening or anything that we should know about related to the work and how people can take a deeper dive with you on this?
There will be a book club. I haven't figured out the dates yet, but there will be a book club that will include some of the practices. So there'll be one that's in person in Winston and one online for people, which I'm excited about. And then there are some, depends on where people live, but in-person events coming up, not just in North Carolina, but other places, immersions, weekend immersions and book events where I'll share more. It's a combination of the practices and book reading and meditations. So it's a fun flow. So yeah, people can stay tuned on my website, michellecjohnson.com, if they want to stay up to date about what's happening.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
you.
I appreciate you. Thank you very much.